Yeah. Oh, yeah. God, well, yes, it's time to pray over a meal. God gets consideration. We want to give him consideration. What is the way that we're approaching God? Do we have an affection for him? The passage says this to us. Verse 17, zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus, in this moment, demonstrates to these people that the temple is not simply there for their benefit. It's there so that they can commune with God and interact with God, but express a sacrifice to God. Zeal for your house will consume me. Do we have a zeal for who God is? Do we have a passion for who God is? Are we consumed by who God is? And the idea here is worship, really. And worship's an interesting thing because it's a word that musicians have stolen. When we consider the idea of worship as to what takes place on this stage, sometimes on Sunday mornings, if you can play keys, or you can play drums, or you can play an organ. It's a word that's been hijacked. But when we look into the language of the New Testament, what we find is this. The book of Romans lets us know that we're to be living sacrifices, spiritual acts of worship. And what that lets us know very intently is this. Worship is not bound up in what takes place in this room. And I'm not talking about instruments, guitars or pianos or organs. I don't really care. Worship is bound up in this. It is bound up in the way that we live. A.W. Tozer, a theologian, says this to us, that if we will not worship 7 days of the week, then we do not worship one. Worship is not simply something that is contained in this room, that takes place in this room. God calls us to be worshipers in the way that we treat other people. God calls me and he calls you to be worshipers in the way that we treat our families, in the way that I interact with my wife, in the way that I treat my son. God calls me to be a worshiper, a living sacrifice, showing that he has authority over me in the way that I interact with my neighbor. In the way that my heart deals with frustration at work, God calls me to show that he is my authority. In the way that I handle the idea that my neighbor won't cut his grass, God calls me to say that he's my authority. That's what worship is. Expressing to God who you are is much more important than who I am. Are we really worshiping? Personal worship is to be expressed weekly when we gather together. This is corporate worship. But if what takes place in here is not a reflection of what takes place outside of here, then what we have here is a show. It is entertainment-based. Because no matter how good of a musician Michael is, no matter how great of a voice that Tyra or whoever our soloist happens to be is, no matter how charismatic our preacher or speaker or whatever we happen to call him that day is, if our hearts are not affectionate for the love and mercy expressed to us by Jesus Christ, then we do not worship. Do we worship? Kevin called me the other day. It was an odd conversation. He lets me know that he and Ashley are about to go meet with a caterer, and her dad can't go, Ashley's dad, but he wants me to go. And I said, no, y'all can have that. So Kevin, he's really excited about meeting with this caterer, and here's why. He thinks they're going to feed him. He thinks they're going to feed him. And he sends me this text message later, and it says this: you won't believe it. They just showed me pictures of food. I started to think if I was throwing a reception, like what I would have there. And I realized a lot of the things that we eat at wedding receptions I care little about. Like I'm not into frou-frou food or quiche or those little mints, anything like that. If I'm throwing a reception, here's what we're having. First and foremost, we're going to start with Claydo's Pizza. Like I went with Claydo's Pizza. It's on East Springer Road. You can call Claydo. His number's there. He paid me a lot of money to put this up. And Claydo's Pizza is going to be there because Claydo's Pizza is fantastic. And then not only am I going to have Claydo's Pizza there, I'm going to make sure that I have Chicken McNuggets from McDonald's because there's no nugget like a Chicken McNugget. And not only am I going to have pigs in a blanket, Those, I'm pretty sure, the manna that fell from heaven and the quail, that's what that is. A kosher version. And I'm going to have one more thing. Hot wings. Because hot wings are awesome. Now, the thing is, I can show you these pictures, and these pictures are great. Like, you can see the picture of the pizza, and you can see the grease dripping off of the McNugget. You can see the heat coming off the wings and the blanket that the pig's in. But if you've not experienced this, then all this is something that I show you, which is just a reflection of something that you're missing. Do we have the idea from what Scripture tells us that our worship together that celebrates the act of God in our personal lives throughout the week is something that has meaning and value simply because of the personal worship that we have had? This is a gathering and a celebration of what God does in us and through us as we live daily life. Passage tells us this very quickly. Verse 18, then the Jews demanded of him, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this? If you'll notice, they did not ask this when he's running oxen around a room. They wait till it's kind of slowed down, like, who gives you the authority to do this? Why in the world do you have the power to do this? And Jesus very quickly lets them know this. Destroy this house, verse 19. Destroy this temple. I'll raise it in 3 days. Here's their question. Who told you that you own the temple? And Jesus replies, I own the temple. I am the temple. See, if the temple is where you meet God, then the frustration of Jesus that we see in this passage comes because these people are taking for granted the idea of meeting God through their sacrifice. And they're taking for granted the love that God has shown them so that they're enabled to do sacrifice. And for us as believers, we are to realize that we are only able to meet God in Jesus. You, as a follower of Jesus, do not meet God through any good, meritorious act that you do. You do not meet God because of the nice things that you say to people around you. You meet God only through Jesus. Jesus says, I am the temple. Jesus would also let us know very quickly that the priest, I am the priest. Jesus would let us know as we look through the canon of the New Testament that, what do you mean sacrifice? I am the sacrifice. And Jesus sees in this passage that people are taking him for granted in very much the way that we take him for granted.